I was standing on the freezing tarmac of a private airfield, my breath hitching in the sub-zero air, watching my own father board a Gulfstream G650 with my stepmother and their real children, while he looked me dead in the eye and told me there wasn't enough room for my luggage or my attitude on the flight to our Swiss chalet. This wasn't just any day. It was Christmas Eve, the one night where even the coldest families are supposed to pretend they care. And while the rest of the world was wrapping presents and sipping cocoa, I was being abandoned in a literal snowstorm by the Billionaire family, who had treated me like a ghost for over 20 years. But as the jet engines began to whine and the smell of fuel filled my lungs, I realized they had made their final mistake. They thought they were leaving behind a discarded nuisance, but what they didn't know was that I held the digital keys to the very empire they used to look down on me. And by the time their luxury jet touched down in the snowy peaks of the Alps, I was going to make sure they had absolutely nothing to come home to. No money, no reputation, and no legacy. Am I the villain for dismantling my father's multi-billion-dollar legacy on the most joyful night of the year? Or would you have pulled the trigger on the revenge I'd been planning since I was a 10-year-old boy watching my mother cry over a stack of eviction notices? Please, you have to tell me if I went too far, because as I stand here watching the snow slowly cover my boots and that multi-million-dollar jet disappear into the heavy gray clouds, I don't feel a single shred of regret. In fact, for the first time in my life, I finally feel warm. To truly understand how a biological father could leave his eldest son stranded in a blizzard on Christmas, you have to understand the toxic, gilded hierarchy of the Sterling family. My father, Richard Sterling, isn't just a man. He's a brand, a walking monument to ego who measures the value of a human soul in quarterly earnings, offshore accounts, and social pedigree. He didn't grow up with money, which makes his arrogance even more insufferable. My mother, Sarah, was his first wife, the woman who was there when he was nothing more than a desperate guy with a laptop and a dream. She was the one who worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat while he innovated. And she was the one who actually provided the seed money for Sterling Global. Though the world would never know that because Richard spent decades rewriting his own history, he decided, once he hit his first 100 million, that my mother wasn't polished enough for the billionaire lifestyle he'd achieved. She didn't know which fork to use at a gala, and her accent was too working class for the boardrooms of London and New York. So when I was only 6 years old, he discarded her like a piece of outdated software, replacing her with Evelyn, a trophy wife who viewed me not as a stepson, but as a walking, talking reminder of Richard's lower-class origins that she wanted to bury. Growing up in the shadow of the new Sterling family was a masterclass in psychological warfare. While Julian and Beatrice, the children Richard had with Evelyn, were draped in cashmere and sent to elite boarding schools in Switzerland, I was the forgotten variable in the equation. My mother passed away 5 years ago, alone in a small apartment, her health destroyed by years of stress and poverty, all while Richard was busy in the south of France buying his 3rd yacht and naming it after Evelyn. He didn't even attend the funeral. He sent a generic floral arrangement and a check for $5,000, which I promptly tore up and mailed back to his office in pieces. Since her death, I've been kept around the company like a mascot for family values. A mid-level analyst job with a salary that barely covers my rent in the city, while my half-siblings were groomed for the throne. Julian, who has the intellectual depth of a teaspoon and the work ethic of a sloth, was made executive vice president, while I was tucked away in a windowless office in the basement, tasked with cleaning up the astronomical messes he made on a weekly basis. I spent the last 3 years of my life quietly fixing the massive accounting errors Julian had stumbled into, essentially saving the company from 3 different federal audits and a dozen lawsuits, all without ever taking a dime of credit. I did it because I thought, in some delusional part of my brain, that if I worked hard enough, Richard would finally look at me and see a son instead of a mistake. The lead up to this specific Christmas was supposed to be the turning point. Richard had called what he termed a mandatory family summit at our private estate in Verbier. The email was uncharacteristically personal, hinting at a major inheritance announcement and a restructuring of the family trust. For a brief, shining moment, I let myself hope. I thought maybe, just maybe, he was finally going to acknowledge that I was the one holding the company together while Julian spent the travel budget on bottle service in Ibiza. I spent my meager savings on high-end gifts for them, a vintage watch for Richard, a rare silk scarf for Evelyn. And I showed up at the private terminal at 5 a.m., exactly as the itinerary demanded. The wind was already howling, and the sky was a bruised purple, threatening the storm of the century. When I arrived, the hangar was buzzing with activity. Evelyn was there, looking like a villain from a high-fashion movie, draped in white mink and surrounded by a literal mountain of luggage. She was shrieking at the ground crew because her 3 trunks of designer ski gear and her essential holiday decor were taking up too much space. Richard was pacing, looking at his watch every 30 seconds, the image of corporate stress. When he finally looked at me, he didn't see a son who had traveled 2 hours in the snow to be there. He saw a problem. He looked at the cargo hold of the G650, then at my single suitcase, and then back at Evelyn's mountain of fur and leather. Without a hint of hesitation or emotion, he told me that the weight limits for the flight were extremely strict due to the incoming storm and the fuel required for the diversion. He said, "Look, there's just no room for your extra weight or your attitude right now. Julian and Beatrice need to be there for the board meeting tomorrow morning. Just take a commercial flight and meet us there on the 26th. I stood there, stunned. I told him that the weather report said all commercial flights out of the regional airport were already being cancelled. He knew that. He looked me dead in the eye, gave a dismissive wave of his hand and said, "Then I guess you'll have to figure it out, won't you? You're a sterling. Use some initiative for once." He turned his back on me and walked up the stairs of the jet. Evelyn didn't even look back. She just adjusted her sunglasses and followed him. Julian, as he walked past, actually had the audacity to smirk and whisper, "Better luck next year, basement boy," before the cabin door hissed shut. As the roar of the engines began to vibrate in my chest, I sat down on my suitcase in the empty, freezing hangar. The silence that followed the jet's departure was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of a bridge burning. But here's the thing about being the invisible son who handles the boring paperwork. When people think you're nobody, they don't bother hiding who they really are. For the past year, I hadn't just been fixing Julian's mistakes. I'd been documenting every single one of them with surgical precision. I'd discovered that Richard hadn't just been a tough businessman. He'd been a predator. He had been leveraging the company's core pension funds, the retirement money of thousands of loyal employees, into a high-risk offshore venture in the Cayman Islands that was technically legal through a series of loopholes, but ethically disastrous. It was a house of cards that was highly sensitive to market perception and regulatory scrutiny. But the biggest secret I held was much more personal. As the executor of my late mother's very meager estate, I had spent the last few months digging through her old storage units. I found a series of original, notarized documents from the late 80s that had never been filed in the digital era. They proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the initial seed money for Sterling Global, the first $5 million that started it all, didn't come from Richard's innate genius or a small loan from a friend. It came from a trust fund my mother had inherited from her grandfather, a fund that Richard had illegally liquidated by forging her signature while she was recovering from the birth of, well, me. In legal terms, my mother had owned 51% of the founding shares that should have passed to her heir. To me, Richard hadn't just cheated on my mother. He had robbed her of the empire they built together, and then spent 20 years gaslighting me into thinking I was lucky to even have a job at the company. I wasn't just a disgruntled son anymore sitting in a cold hangar. I was a ticking time bomb with administrative access to every server, every private ledger, every offshore account, and every dirty secret the Sterling family had ever tried to bury. I realized right there, with the frost forming on my jacket, that I had 2 choices. I could wait for the storm to pass, take a coach-class flight on the 26th, and beg for a seat at their table while they laughed at me over expensive wine. Or I could flip the entire table over and burn the room to the ground. I chose the fire. I left the airport, drove my old, beat-up car back to my small apartment, and sat down at my desk. I didn't even take off my coat. I opened my laptop and began the systematic process of deconstructing a multi-billion-dollar dynasty. I had spent months preparing for a moment I wasn't sure I'd ever have the nerve to execute. I started by triggering the emergency ethics disclosure protocols I'd quietly embedded into the company's internal compliance software months ago. By midnight, An encrypted package containing proof of Richard's embezzlement and Julian's gross negligence was being delivered to the personal emails of every member of the board of directors, as well as the lead investigators at the SEC. I also sent the documents regarding my mother's stolen inheritance to a high-powered firm that specialized in corporate bloodletting. The kind of lawyers who don't sleep until they've extracted every ounce of justice. So that's where I stood, the forgotten son with his finger on the delete button of a billion-dollar empire. I had the power to make them land in Switzerland as commoners, stripped of their titles, their dignity, and their stolen wealth before they even had a chance to check into their five-star hotel. Before I tell you exactly how the confrontation went down when they finally realized their world was ending in the middle of a Swiss blizzard, I want you to pause. I want you to really think about the years of being pushed aside, the way they treated my mother, and the way they left me in the cold on Christmas Eve without a second thought. Would you have stayed quiet just to preserve your own small, safe paycheck and a life of mediocrity? Or would you have burnt it all down like I did? Drop a comment right now and tell me. Was this justified revenge? Or was I just acting out of pure bitterness? I need to know what you would do in my shoes before I reveal the final blow. The next morning, while the Sterlings were likely waking up in their heated silk sheets, sipping mimosas and overlooking the Matterhorn, the digital world exploded. I had timed the leaks perfectly. By 8 a.m., the headline was everywhere. Sterling Global CEO accused of multi-billion-dollar fraud and estate theft. The stock price didn't just dip. It went into a free fall, losing 40% of its value in the first hour of pre-market trading. Because I had leaked the specific evidence proving my mother's majority ownership stake was obtained through forgery, the company's assets were immediately frozen by a court order I'd helped facilitate through an emergency injunction. I received the first call from Richard at 10 a.m. I watched his name flash on my screen. Dad. And I felt nothing but a cold, hard clarity. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that started with a demand and ended with a plea, his voice cracking in a way I'd never heard before. The second call was from Evelyn, screaming so loud I could hear her from 3 feet away from the phone. She was at a luxury boutique in Verbier, trying to buy a $100,000 watch, and her credit cards, all of them, had been declined. The accounts were flagged, the credit lines severed. I blocked her number. By noon, Julian was calling me, sobbing like a child. He was at the chalet, and the local authorities had already arrived to inform them that the property was being placed under a lien. He asked me what was happening to the servers, why he couldn't log into his accounts, and what I had done. I finally picked up the phone. The silence on my end was heavy. I told him very slowly and very calmly. Remember what Dad said at the hangar, Julian? About weight limits? Well, it turns out there wasn't enough room in the digital vault for your ego and your incompetence anymore. I had to clear some space for the truth. I hung up before he could respond. The fallout was even more spectacular than I had imagined. Because the family jet was technically registered as a company asset under investigation for tax evasion, it was impounded by Swiss authorities at the airport the moment they tried to refuel for a planned trip to St. Moritz. The billionaire Sterlings were literally stranded in a foreign country with no access to their liquid funds, no private transport, and a legal firestorm waiting for them the second they stepped back onto American soil. Richard tried to call me one last time from a borrowed phone, threatening to disown me, to leave me with nothing. I laughed, a genuine, heartfelt laugh, and reminded him that he couldn't disown someone who had already disclaimed him. I told him that I'd spent my morning with a pro bono legal team, ensuring that any of my mother's recovered stake would be diverted into a charitable trust for low-income families, the very people Richard had spent his career exploiting. By the time New Year's rolled around, the Sterling name was mud. Richard was forced to step down in disgrace, facing a litany of federal charges. Evelyn, true to her nature, was already filing for divorce to try and salvage whatever hidden assets she thought he had left, but she was finding that I had been very thorough in cleaning those out too. Julian was facing a potential prison sentence for the documents he'd signed without reading, proving that sometimes being the smart one is just about paying attention to the fine print. I, on the other hand, didn't want the billions. I didn't want the jet or the chalet. I sat in my mother's favorite old, dusty coffee shop on the corner of 5th and Main, watching the snow fall on a world that felt a lot lighter. I had enough from my mother's legitimate shares to live comfortably, but more importantly, I had the truth. Looking back, people might say I ruined Christmas, but I think I finally brought some honesty to the holiday. You can't build a life of luxury on someone else's ruin and expect the foundation to hold forever. If there's a moral here, it's that the person you think is the least important in the room is usually the one who knows where all the bodies are buried. Don't leave your family out in the cold, because they might just decide to freeze you out of your own life permanently. Like this video if you think the Sterlings got exactly what they deserved for their decades of arrogance. And make sure to hit that subscribe button, so you don't miss the next time someone decides to stop playing nice and starts playing for keeps. This was a long journey, and I appreciate you sticking through the whole story. Share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Did I go too far by destroying the company? Or was this the best Christmas present a son could ever give his mother's memory? I'll be reading your responses, and I'll see you all in the next story.